Classic Horror with Dom Newton. Episode 7, Lost Hearts by M.R. James. It was, as far as I can ascertain, in September of the year 1811 that a post-chaise drew up before the door of Aswarby Hall in the heart of Lincolnshire. The little boy, who was the only passenger in the chaise, and who jumped out as soon as it had stopped, looked about him with the keenest curiosity during the short interval that elapsed between the ringing of the bell and the opening of the hall door. He saw a tall, square, red-brick house, built in the reign of Anne. A stone-pillared porch had been added in the purer classical style of 1790. The windows of the house were many, tall and narrow, with small panes and thick white woodwork. A pediment pierced with a round window crowned the front. There were wings to right and left, connected by curious glazed galleries, supported by colonnades, with the central block. These wings were plainly contained the stables and offices of the house. Each was surmounted by an ornamental cupola, with a gilded vane. An evening light shone on the building, making the window panes glow like so many fires. Away from the hall, in front stretched a flat park studded with oaks and fringed with firs, which stood out against the sky. The clock in the church tower, buried in trees on the edge of the park, only its golden weathercock catching the light, was striking 6, and the sound came gently beating down the wind. It was altogether a pleasant impression, though tinged with the sort of melancholy appropriate to an evening in early autumn, that was conveyed to the mind of the boy, who was standing in the porch waiting for the door to open to him. The post-chaise had brought him from Warwickshire, where some 6 months before he had been left an orphan. Now, owing to the generous offer of his elderly cousin, Mr. Abney, he had come to live at Aswarby. The offer was unexpected, because all who knew anything of Mr. Abney looked upon him as a somewhat austere recluse, into whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import a new, and it seemed incongruous element. The truth is that very little was known of Mr. Abney's pursuits or temper. The professor of Greek at Cambridge had been heard to say that no one knew more of the religious beliefs of the later pagans than did the owner of Aswarby. Certainly, his library contained all the then available books bearing on the mysteries, the Orphic poems, the worship of Mithras, and the Neo-Platonists. In the marble-paved hall stood a fine group of Mithras slaying a bull, which had been imported from the Levant at great expense by the owner. He had contributed a description of it to the Gentleman's Magazine, and he had written a remarkable series of articles in the Critical Museum on the superstitions of the Romans of the Lower Empire. He was looked upon, in fine, as a man wrapped up in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbours that they should even have heard of his orphan cousin, Stephen Elliott, much more than he should have volunteered to make him an inmate of Aswarby Hall. Whatever may have been expected by his neighbours, it is certain that Mr. Abney, the tall, the thin, the austere, seemed inclined to give his young cousin a kindly reception. The moment the front door was opened, he darted out of his study, rubbing his hands with delight. "How are you, my boy? How are you? How old are you?" said he. "That is, you are not too much tired, I hope, by your journey to eat your supper?" "No, thank you, sir," said Master Elliot. "I am pretty well." "That's a good lad," said Mr. Abney. "How old are you, my boy?" It seemed a little odd that he should have asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their acquaintance. "I am 12 years old next birthday, sir," said Stephen. "And when is your birthday, my dear boy? 11th of September, eh? That's well, that's very well. Nearly a year hence, isn't it? I like to get these things down in my book. Sure it's 12? Certain?" "Yes, quite sure, sir." Well, take him in Mrs. Bunch's room, Parks, and let him have his tea, supper, whatever it is." "Yes, sir," answered the staid Mr. Parks, and conducted Stephen to the lower regions. Mrs. Bunch was the most comfortable and human person whom Stephen had as yet met at Aswarby. She made him completely at home. They were great friends in a quarter of an hour, and great friends they remained. Mrs. Bunch had been born in the neighbourhood some 55 years before the date of Stephen's arrival, and her residence at the Hall was of 20 years' standing. If anyone knew the ins and outs house in the district, Mrs. Bunch knew them. She was by no means disinclined to communicate her information. Certainly there were plenty of things about the Hall and the Hall gardens which Stephen, who was of an adventurous and inquiring turn, was anxious to have explained to him. Who built the temple at the end of the Laurel Walk? Who was the old man whose picture hung on the staircase, sitting at a table with a skull under his hand? These and many similar points were cleared up by the resources of Mrs. Bunch's powerful intellect. There were others, however, of which the explanations furnished were less satisfactory. One November evening, Stephen was sitting by the fire in the housekeeper's room, reflecting upon his surroundings. "Is Mr. Abney a good man, and will he go to heaven?" he suddenly asked, with the peculiar confidence which children possess in the ability of their elders to settle such questions, the decisions of which is believed to be reserved for other tribunals. "Good? Bless the child," said Mrs. Bunch. "Master's as kind a soul as I ever did see. Didn't I never tell you of the little boy as he took him out of the streets, as you may say, this 7 years back, and the little girl, 2 years after I first come here? No, do tell me about them, Mrs. Bunch, now, this minute." "Well," said Mrs. Bunch, "the little girl I don't seem to recollect so much about, and her master brought her back from his walk one day, and gave orders to Mrs. Ellis, as was housekeeper then, and she should be took care of, and the poor child hadn't no one belonging to her. She told me so herself. And here she lived with us a matter of 3 weeks it might be, and then whether she was something of a gipsy in her blood or what not. But one morning she was out of her bed, and before any of us opened her eye, and neither track yet trace of her was yet found. Master was wonderful put about, and had all the ponds tracked, but it's my belief she was away with them gipsies, though singing round the house as much of an hour as the night went, and Parks he declared that he heard them a-calling in the woods all that afternoon. Dear, dear, an odd child she was, so silent in her ways and all, but I was wonderful taken up with her, so domesticated she was, surprising." "And what about the little boy?" said Stephen. "Oh, that poor boy," sighed Mrs. Bunch. "He was a foreigner, Giovanni he called himself, and he came a-tweaking his hurdy-gurdy round and about and drive one winter day, and master had him in a minute, and it's all about where he came from, and how old he was, and how he made his way, and where were his relatives, and all as kind as I could wish. But it went the same with him. They're an unruly lot, them foreign nations, I do suppose, and he was off one fine morning, just the same as the girl. Why he went, and what he'd done was our question, for as much as a year after, for he never took his hurdy-gurdy, and there it lays on the shelf." The remainder of the evening was spent by Stephen in miscellaneous cross-examination of Mrs. Bunch, in efforts to extract a tune from the hurdy-gurdy. That night he had a curious dream. At the end of the passage at the top of the house, in which his bedroom was situated, there was an old disused bathroom. It was kept locked, but the upper half of the door was glazed, and since the muslin curtains which used to hang there had long been gone, you could look in and see the lead-lined bath affixed to the wall on the right hand, with its head towards the window. On the night of which I am speaking, Stephen Elliott found himself, as he thought, looking through the glazed door. The moon was shining through the window. He was gazing at a figure which lay in the bath. His description of what he saw reminds me of what I once beheld myself in the famous vaults of St. Michan's Church in Dublin, which possessed the horrid property of preserving corpses from decay for centuries. A figure inexpressibly thin and pathetic, of a dusty leaden colour, enveloped in a shroud-like garment, thin lips crooked into a faint and dread, my hands practically over the region of the heart. As he looked upon it, a distant, almost inaudible moan seemed to issue from its lips, and the arms began to stir. The terror of the sight forced Stephen backwards, and he awoke to the fact that he was indeed standing on the cold boarded floor of the passage, in the full light of the moon. With a courage which I do not think can be common among boys of his age, he went to the door of the bathroom to ascertain if the figure of his dream were really there. It was not, and he went back to bed. Mrs. Bunch was much impressed next morning by his story, and went so far as to replace the muslin curtain over the glazed door of the bathroom. Mr. Abney, moreover, to which he confided his experiences at breakfast, was greatly interested, and made notes of the matter in what he called his book. The spring equinox was approaching, as Mr. Abney frequently reminded his cousin, adding that this had always been considered by the ancients to be a critical time for the young, that Stephen would do well to take care of himself and to shut his bedroom window at night, and that Censorinus had some valuable remarks on the subject. Two incidents that occurred about this time made an impression upon Stephen's mind. The first was after an unusually uneasy and oppressed night that he had passed, though he could not recall any particular dream that he had had. The following evening Mrs. Bunch was occupying herself in mending his nightgown. "Gracious me, Master Stephen," she broke forth rather irritably. "How do you manage to tear your nightdress all to flints this way? Look here, sir. What trouble you do give to poor servants that have to darn and mend after you." There was indeed a most destructive and apparently wanton series of slits or scorings in the garment, which would undoubtedly require a skilful needle to make good. They were confined to the left side of the chest, long parallel slits about 6 inches in length, some of them not quite piercing the texture of the linen. Stephen could only express his entire ignorance of their origin. He was sure they were not there the night before, but, he said, "Mrs. Bunch, they're just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door, and I'm sure I never had anything to do with them." Mrs. Bunch gazed at him open-mouthed, then snatched up a candle, departed hastily from the room, and was heard making her way upstairs. In a few minutes she came down. "Well," she said, "Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me how them marks and scratches can ha' come there. Too high up for any cat or dog to have made 'em, much less a rat, for all the world like a Chinaman's fingernails, as my uncle in the tea trade used to tell us when we were girls together. I wouldn't say nothing to the master, not if I was you, Master Stephen, my dear, and just turn the key of the door when you go to bed." "I always do, Mrs. Bunch, as soon as I've said my prayers." "Oh, there's a good child. Always say your prayers, then no one can't hurt you." Herewith Mrs. Bunch addressed herself to mending the injured nightgown, with intervals of meditation until bedtime. This was on the Friday night in March 1812. On the following evening, the usual duet of Stephen and Mrs. Bunch was augmented by the sudden arrival of Mr. Parkes, the butler, who as a rule kept himself rather to himself in his own pantry. He did not see that Stephen was there. He was, moreover, flustered, and less slow of speech than was his wont. "Master may get up to his own wine if he likes, of an evening," was his own remark. "Either I do it in the daytime or not at all, Mrs. Bunch. I don't know what it may be. Very like it's the rats or the wind got into the cellars, but I'm not as young as I was, and I can't go through with it as I have done." "Well, Mr. Parkes, you know it's a surprising place for rats in the hall." "I'm not denying that, Mrs. Bunch, and to be sure, many a time I've heard a tale from men in the shipyards about the rat that could speak. I never laid no confidence in that before, but tonight, if I'd demean myself to lay my ear to the door of that further bin, I could pretty much have heard what they were saying." "Oh, there, Mr. Parkes, I've no patience with your fancies. Rats talking in the wine cellar, indeed. Well, Mrs. Bunch, I've no wish to argue with you. All I say is, if you choose to go to that far bin and lay your ear to the door, you may prove my words this minute." "What nonsense you talk, Mr. Parkes. Not fit for children to listen to. Why, you'll be frightening Master Stephen there out of his wits." "What, Master Stephen?" said Parkes, awaking to the consciousness of the boy's presence. "Master Stephen knows well enough I'm a playing a joke with you, Mrs. Bunch." In fact, Master Stephen knew much too well to suppose that Mr. Parkes had in the first instance intended a joke. He was interested, not altogether pleasantly, in the situation, but all his questions were unsuccessful in inducing the butler to give any more detailed account of his experiences in the wine cellar. We have now arrived March the 24th, 1812. It was a day of curious experience for Stephen. A windy, noisy day,